So here we have a data log, and on the right hand side I have a sidebar input sheet where I can just put in the values for one of the rows in the data log and submit them, just like this. So we can type in 35, 0.02 and hit submit. And you can see that it appears down the bottom here. Now I've shared this Google Sheet with another editor, Mrs. Yagi-san Atade, that you can see in the purple here. And she can do the same thing right now. So maybe she chose EVLog 2 and she went 70 kilometers and used 0.04, which is 4% of a charge, and hit submit. And you can see now she has also added in her data here. Now let's head back to me, the owner of the sheet. Now, maybe I don't want other editors to come in here and manually edit this data log sheet. My first instinct is to go to data logs and select the drop up menu and click on protect sheets and set permissions, and make that permission only for me, and hit done. Now I've locked this just so I can edit it. Now there is a problem here, and I'll show you. I can still edit in the ranges here. So again, if I type in 35 and 0.02 and hit submit for EVLog1, this enters fine. But if I go over to Mrs. Yagi-san Atade's account, and she does the same, selecting EV4, 70 Ks she drove, and 0.04, and hit submit, she's going to get an error. So it says you are trying to edit a protected cell or object. Please contact the spreadsheet owner to remove the protection if you need to edit. So basically it means even if she submits this, it's going to check if those cells are editable by her. And if they aren't, then she cannot access them. So how can we work around this? Well, that's the topic of this tutorial. Now, if you want to play along, and I encourage that you do, there is a starter sheet in the description below. Let's get started. So we need to enter into our Google App Script, and we've already got our setup for all our Google App Script to run the sidebar and validate everything already. If you want to know how we built this sidebar, you'll find a link up in the right hand corner right about now. All right, let's head over to extensions, and head over to extensions, click App Scripts, and that should get you into your Google App Script. So we have a lot of functions here, and we're going to work on one specific function at the moment. So let's scroll down until you get to the appendEvLog. You can also press Ctrl F and type in appendEvLog and scroll down until you can find the function here. So how are we going to get the data from an editor who doesn't have permission to edit the data log and into the data log? Well, what we're going to use is a combination of three things. The first one is PropertyService, lock service, and installable triggers. At its core, what we want to do is grab the input data, which we're grabbing here from the sidebar. As you can see, it appears like this. And then we're going to store it in the property service. Now let's have a look at the property service over here. So the property service lets you store simple data in a key value pairs scoped to one script, one user of a script, or one document in which an add-on is used. So that means we can store some data off the Google Sheet on our Google Apps Script site. And we can do this either for an individual, for the script, or for the document. For us, we're going to use the script because that is a universal storage for any user using the app script. So let's head back. So a couple of things we need to do first. One, we don't need to get this spreadsheet or the destination sheet here. All we're going to do in this appendEvLog is store the data. So let's just delete that for now. We still need to generate the date, and we still need to get the user's email, so we'll keep that. We also need to then grab the date, the email, and the input and store it all in one array. After that, we can't append this array to the last row in our data log at the moment. We're going to store it in our property service. So we're going to delete this as well. Now that we're here, it's time to get started. So the property service is going to be a shared resource. That means more than one person could access this service at once. Now, if we have two people accessing the property service and trying to input data at the same time, we're going to get something that's called race conditions. In this situation, if two users are trying to store data in the property service at the same time, one of the users' data might not be saved. So what we need to do here first is lock this process to prevent only one person using it at a time. And we can do this with the lock service. So as you can see in the docs, the lock service allows scripts to prevent concurrent access to sections in code. This can be useful when you have multiple users or processes modifying a shared resource and want to prevent collisions. So this is what we're trying to prevent now, collisions in accessing our property service. So the first thing we need to do is create a lock variable, and it's a constant variable, so we'll say const lock equals lock service. And we want a script lock. So there's a couple of different types you can see: a document lock, script lock, and user lock. Just like I mentioned earlier with the property service, where there's ones for documents, scripts, and users. So what we want is the script lock. Once we called the script for the lock service, we now need to see if we can access the lock. So that basically means if there's someone else running this process at the moment, then we can't jump on and use it. So we need to continually check until we have permission to run the next part of the script. So there's two ways of doing this, and the first way we're going to handle this is with the wait lock. And the wait lock takes a timeout in milliseconds. This is how long the lock service is going to wait until it gives up. So let's just put in a very generous 30,000 milliseconds or 30 seconds. Now the wait lock attempts to acquire the lock, timing out with an exception after the provided number of milliseconds. If this lock fails, it's going to return an error. Now you can see in the example here there's a try catch statement. We're going to give this a miss for now because we've got enough that we're going to learn in this tutorial already. What we want to do is return an error back to our sidebar if the user couldn't access this part of the script, because there's no point continuing on because they can't add to the property service. So we'll just leave it as is, and if there's an error here, the wait lock, and it can't get a lock, so after 30 seconds it can't access this script, which would be really weird, then it's going to throw back an error and it's going to spit it out down the bottom here. Okay, so now we've got our lock wait. After that, once it can get a lock, it will lock this next set of script. So the next thing we need to do is grab our property from the property service. So let's make another constant variable, and we'll call it prop for property, and we'll call the property service class and get. Now this time, remember, we're going to use get script properties. These properties are shared amongst all users using this script. And then we need to grab the property that we're going to store our data in, and we'll store it in a constant variable called data prop. So here we can say prop dot get property, and then we try and find the property by name, just like you would with an object. So if you have an object and inside that object there's a property called bird and the value is called chicken, then we're looking for bird. But in our case, we're looking for input data. Now, if this property doesn't exist, it's going to return null. And right now, because we haven't added anything, it will return null. Now you can see what properties are available if you go over here, over to the left-hand side menu and click the project settings and scroll down, you'll see these script properties here. And any properties that appear will be available here. Okay, let's head back. Okay, so right now, because we haven't got anything, that's going to return null, which is fine. What we intend on putting inside this property is an array of data, or more accurately, a 2D array of data. The problem is, with PropertyService, they only store strings of data. We can't store something like this. We need to be able to convert this to a string. Fortunately, JavaScript can help us out here with JSON parse and JSON stringify. Right now, we're trying to get the property, so that means we need to pass the value that is currently stored as a string back into something readable. So let's use JSON.parse around this here. Okay, so right now that should give us null. So why don't we just go down here and test a few things so you can see what's going on. So let's create a quick test function. Okay, so let's just grab this for now. And let's just console log data prop. And hit save. And we'll go up here and we'll just run test and run. And you can see it's returned null because there's no values in it. Awesome. Okay, so next we need to test if there is a value or if there isn't a value. If there is a value, we want to append to this property. If there isn't, we just want to add to it. So let's create a variable called allData. And this variable is going to say if data prop spits back null, and we're just using a ternary operator here, which is sort of a single line if statement. All we want to do is input this data. Now, The way we're inputting our data, which I'll show you a little bit later, is as a 2D array. So a 2D array is basically an array that has a column and a row. So we need to put an extra set of braces around our data here. So if the data property spits back null, that means the input data is empty. We just want to make all data a 2D array just with this data. Otherwise, we want to grab the data in data property and concatenate it, which basically means join it together. And here we're just going to add in our data as a 2D array. Now, one important thing to note is that Property Services does have its limitations in how much data it can store per property and over all properties as well. So it's important to check the documentation on how much you're going to store. I'm pretty safe in the knowledge that even if I have several hundred users adding data at the same time, that this small amount of data will store safely within the property. Okay, so once we have that, what we need to do next is send this all data back to our input data. So we'll go prop dot set property. Basically, every time you set a property, you can't update a property. You can only overwrite an existing property. So that's why we're grabbing it first. So we'll go property set property, and we will create the property again, input data, and then this time we want to store all data. We're going to use JSON stringify to convert our 2D array into a string. And once that's done, we are going to release our lock to allow another user to be able to store their data. Not release lick, release lock. That would be weird. Okay, let's test this out a little bit more so we know everything's working fine. How about we use our test function here and call this appendEvLog. Copy that and paste it over here, and we'll just import this as our evlog. So we'll make our const input equal to just what we have up in the notes here, and you should have the same in your notes as well, so you can grab that if you test too, which is probably a good idea to test at this stage. Cool, so we've got that input appendEvLog, great, awesome. Then we're going to console log the results. Let's call this again. So we'll copy this over. All right, so now we're just going to call this appendEvLog, grab all of the data, check to see if there is a property called input data. If there isn't and it returns null, then we're just going to add in this data inside a 2D array. If there's one that exists, then we're going to just append to it and then store it back in our input data property. Then release our lock. After that, we're going to call the property service, check our input data, and then log what's in the input data at the moment. So let's go ahead and run our test and see if we have made any mistakes. Cool. You can see in our input data property, we have stored this value here. If we run this again, hopefully we should get another value just like this. Let's click run again. Cool. Now we have two versions of this log, all stored in the data property service. Okay, so that's all we need to do for the user to be able to store the data. The next thing we need to do now is to be able to recall this data with a time trigger to be able to store this acting as us, the owner of the sheet. So what we're going to do is create a new function and we're going to call it updateDataLogTrigger. Cool. So again, this time around, we also need to call the lock service because we don't want to be able to grab this data while someone's trying to add to it because we might not get all of the data from the input data sheet. So let's create our lock service constant. Okay, lock service. And again, it's going to be get script lock. All right, so this time around, we need to check if our lock is successful. So const lock success. We won't be using the wait lock here, which returns an error if the user couldn't access the lock service. This time around, we're going to use the try lock. And I'll explain one in a minute. And we'll set the same amount of seconds, 30 seconds or 3000 milliseconds. So the try-lock returns true if it was successful or false if it was unsuccessful. In this case, we don't want to return an error on our time trigger because that can be problematic. And we don't really care, to be honest, because our trigger runs every minute. And if it fails for this time because it didn't manage to get a lock, it can try again the next time. So let's check if our lock wasn't successful. So that means it's going to return false. So if lock success, if not true or false, then we want to return the function and do nothing more. Can't get a lock, no worries, I'll try again in the next minute when the trigger runs. However, if we are successful, then we want to grab our property service and grab our data. So let's go back up to here and just copy and paste our prop variable and our data prop variable and just whack it in under our if lock success statement. And once we've obtained the property data, we want to clear it out for the next time because we don't want to continually add to it if we've already got that data. Otherwise, we'll end up with duplicates in our data log. Let's grab the prop and use the delete property method. Don't use the delete all property method or you'll lose all your properties. You'll be very sad. Let's grab that. Control C, Control V. Nice one. Once that's deleted, we don't need to hold on to this script anymore while everyone's waiting. We can release this lock. So let's go lock, release, lock. And now other people can add to the new input data property. Our next task is to use this data property to update the spreadsheet for our data log. So let's create a spreadsheet variable. So we'll go const ss for spreadsheet equals spreadsheet app, get active spreadsheet. We'll do the trick. And then we need our destination sheet. And here we call our spreadsheet class. And we want to grab the data log sheet. So I'll just double click that, hit Control C. And we can use the get sheet by name method here and just insert that out between two quotation marks. And then we need to grab the first empty row of our data, which is here. So in this case, it's going to be 24. Now, we don't want to manually do that. We can use a spreadsheet app method for this. So let's make another variable, const first empty row equals, and we'll grab the destination sheet and we can use the get last row method here. So that's going to get us to row 23. And we need to add 1 to that to get the empty one. So we'll go plus 1. Simple as that. Next thing we need to do is get the range of our data. So let's use the destination sheet. And now we need to get the range of the location we're going to paste in our data. And we can do this with get range. So get range takes a number of inputs, but for us, we're going to use numerical values for this one. And what are we doing with get range? We need to tell Google Sheets how much data we have in our sheet and where to start pasting our data from. So where we want to start pasting our data from is the first empty row, which is going to be here. So let's grab first empty row and paste that in as our first argument. So row. And the next is column. So our first column is column 1 or A. We're going to use numbers here. We'll say 1. And now we need the number of rows, or how many rows are in this 2D array. Instead of us trying to remember, we are going to get the length of our data property. And that'll give us how many rows down we need to add. And then the next argument is going to be our number of columns. And we can grab data property again for this. And we can look at the first row of our 2D array to see how many columns there are going to be and grab that length. Once we've grabbed our range, we can now add in our values into the range. We've set values. And what values do we want to add in? Well, that's our data prop. So once we've accessed our spreadsheet, it's probably a good idea to use the spreadsheet app.flush method, which applies all pending spreadsheet changes. Okay, If I didn't make any mistakes, we should be able to run the updateDataLogTrigger, and those two properties that we've already got stored away in our property service should be put in here. So let's just run that as a test. UpdateDataLogTrigger and hit run. And let's go and have a look. As you can see, those two values are there. Let's go and quickly check to see if they've been deleted with our little test value here. So let's just comment this out at the moment with a control / and change our function to test. And we should get back null, which we did. One thing I almost forgot to check is what happens if no one has entered in a value at all. We're going to get an error. So if we hit the update data trigger again and run this, now there's nothing in our property, we're going to get an ugly error because we've got no data to add in. So let's just handle that quickly. Just under here, where we've got data property, and basically we want to say if data prop equals null, then we just want to return the function. We don't want to do anything. And that will finish the function at this point here. So if we hit update data log trigger again, hit run, you can see it hasn't done anything. But if we just add in a value like we did here, so we'll just change this to test, hit run, we can see we've got a value added. And let's move this, let's change this function run to update data log trigger and hit run. You can see the value's just been added in now. Perfect. Okay, last thing we need to do before we get to test this glorious piece of coding out. We need to apply a time trigger to this update data log. So let's head over to triggers now. And we're going to add a trigger, then go down until we find our update data log trigger and select event source. That's going to be a time driven trigger, and select type of time. So we want this to be a minute trigger, and the smallest amount of time that we can do is every minute. So this trigger is going to run the update data log every minute. We also want to be kept abreast of any issues or errors that occur. So we're going to keep this notifying me daily with a summary, and that'll come in via email. And let's just save this for now. Okay, so this trigger is up and running and watching every minute using this update log trigger. All right, so let's line some things up so we can time things well. Let's head over here. As the owner, I should be able to add this data in no problem. So let's just type in 35K for me, and then 0.02 use, and just leave it there for a moment. And I'll head over to Mrs. Yagi-san Adade, and let's change our EV to EV4, change her kilometers to 75Ks. Let's change this to 0.04. And let's go ahead and hit submit here. Quickly go over to my account and hit submit here. You can see both have been submitted. And after a little bit of time, within a minute, these two data values have been added. Awesome, everything's working out. Now, right now we've got success item added successfully, and your users might just be thinking, well, when is this going to be added to the data log? Did I make a mistake? Should I hit submit another 1,000 times or re-enter the data again? So what we can do here is just quickly update our success item. And if we scroll up, we can see the success item here. And let's just add to that and say it should appear in the data log sheet in the next minute or so. That should reduce the amount of frantic submit button clicking. Okay, let's give it another quick test. 35, 0.02. Submit, see if I can get this done super quick. EV4, 75, 0.04, submit. Success. Let's look down here, wait for it to happen. And there it is. Good stuff. This wraps up our mini course on creating a data log and data log inputs using an input sheet or using a sidebar in Google Sheets with Google Apps Scripts. If you enjoyed this series and this tutorial, please click that like button and hit subscribe and click on that notification bell for when I create another series that you might be interested in. Until next time.